They found him under the dim glow of a street lamp, a shadow curled in the rain. His fur was matted, soaked through and darkened with something that smelled like smoke and something older loss. The city around him was quiet that night, save for the soft hum of water dripping from the eaves. He lay there, breathing slowly, his chest rising and falling like a fragile prayer. This story will break you and then rebuild you. Rain had settled over the world like a slow sigh. I remember walking past him without seeing him at first. My boots splashed quietly through puddles, the sound swallowed by the heavier silence of that night. There was something still about him that held me in place, though something beyond the mud in his fur, or the limp dragging his weight forward. He was curled beside the edge of a crumbled parking lot, the ground slick with oil and rainwater. Around him the shadows pooled like a tide, pressing close. His head rested on one paw, his eyes half closed, but they weren't asleep. They were somewhere else, entirely locked in a memory I could never touch. I crouched closer without thinking. The closer I got, the heavier the scent became, wet dog earth smoke and something metallic I couldn't name. I could see the scars, now faint lines etched into his flank, and one deep tear along his shoulder that still bled faintly. His breathing was slow, shallow, but steady enough to cling to life. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to call someone. But the world around me was silent except for rain, and something told me no one else would come. And then there was a sound behind me, soft, careful, uncertain. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even a cry. It was the faint shuffle of little feet in wet shoes, pressing forward through puddles. I turned my head, and there she was. A baby in a pink hooded raincoat, tiny hands lifting toward him, unsure but certain. Her mother was a step behind, tired-eyed, distracted. But the child didn't stop. She stepped forward into the rain without hesitation. Her boots splashed. Her small hand stretched toward the German shepherd's trembling head, and he lifted his head, not with strength, not with alertness, but with something quieter, recognition, a slow, soft sigh. The world seemed to hold its breath for that moment. And that was where it began, the moment no one would forget. The rain had not stopped when I returned to that spot the next day. In my mind, I kept replaying the image of the baby's small hand reaching toward him, the way he had lifted his head, not with urgency, but with something softer, like a quiet acceptance. That morning, the parking lot was empty, except for the puddles and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the air. The German shepherd was gone. Only a single paw print remained pressed into the mud, sharp and distinct against the dull gray of the asphalt. It was the kind of detail you remember without meaning to. Later, I heard whispers about him. People in the neighborhood spoke quietly, as if saying his name too loudly might make him vanish. They said he had been seen before days earlier, dragging himself through alleys near abandoned warehouses, always alone. Some said his name was Bruno. Others called him Shadow. No one knew where he came from. No one knew where he was going. I began piecing it together in fragments, each detail like a stitch in an unfinished story. A collar, torn and rusted, found in the weeds behind a burned-down garage. A faded tag that had lost its lettering to years of rain. A faint scent of pine and smoke in his fur. A trace of something that felt like home. I imagined what he might have been before this moment. Once, perhaps, he had a name spoken warmly in the morning light. A bed where the sun found him. A person who waited for him at the end of the day. And now nothing but rain and silence. I could not stop thinking about him. Days later, I found him again, not lying still this time, but moving slowly, limping along the edge of a deserted lot. His ribs showed faintly beneath his fur. His shoulder wound looked worse now, dark and raw. Yet he moved with purpose, as if something unseen was guiding him. That night I followed him at a distance. He went past boarded windows, over broken glass, through streets so quiet they felt abandoned by memory itself. Somewhere in that journey I saw him pause, his ears pricked, his head tilting towards something beyond sight. His breath came in slow clouds in the cold air. Then, without hesitation, he turned and vanished down a narrow alley. The details haunted me, the way his paw pressed into the dirt, leaving a path of wet impressions, the way his breath rose in soft fog against the cold, the low, mournful sound that seemed to come from deep inside him. I didn't know where he was going, but I began to suspect he was searching for something he had lost long before the rain began. And then the baby's face returned to me, the small silent certainty of her reaching hand. Something in her had called to him, something so quiet that only he could hear. I did not know then what it meant, but I knew that the story of that night had not ended. It was only beginning. Days turned into a week, and still the German Shepherd had not been claimed. I began to hear murmurs that the neighborhood had grown used to seeing him, an unspoken figure at the edges of life. He was no longer simply a wounded animal. He had become a ghost of something larger, something unspoken, carried in the hush of rain and shadow. That afternoon, I found him again, not in a parking lot this time, but near the edge of a crumbling playground. The rain had eased into a quiet drizzle. The air smelled of wet grass and iron. He lay beneath the skeletal frame of an old swing set, one paw tucked beneath his chest, eyes half shut. His breathing was steady but deliberate, as if conserving strength. The sound of small footsteps drew my attention before I saw her, the baby. She appeared without warning, her hood pulled up, her boots silent against the wet gravel. She did not run, cry, or call for attention. She simply walked toward him, slow and deliberate, like she had been summoned by something beyond her years. I stayed back. There was something fragile about watching them. She stopped a few feet away. He lifted his head, eyes meeting hers in a way that felt impossible, like they were speaking without words. She crouched, unafraid of the rain or the wound she could not fully see. Her small hand reached out, hovering for a moment over his head. Then she touched him, fingertips resting gently against his fur. He did not flinch. Instead, his breathing shifted. He lowered his head slightly, a quiet sigh escaping him. His body relaxed, the tense line of his shoulders softening under her hand. She stayed there, watching him with no sound, no fuss, no fear. Just presence. There was no name exchanged, no pleading, no noise. Just her and him, as if they understood something no one else could. Her mother's voice came then, soft and hesitant, calling her name from somewhere behind me. The child did not turn. She remained beside him, hand still resting on his shoulder, her small raincoat dripping onto the gravel. The German Shepherd blinked slowly, as if weighing something in the silence. Then he shifted slightly, letting her hand stay there. That moment lasted longer than it should have, longer than rain usually lasts. It was not about rescue. It was something quieter, a silent acknowledgement, a meeting of two wounded worlds. Later I would learn that the baby's name was Amara. She did not speak much. She rarely cried. But her eyes carried a certain stillness, like someone who had already seen too much. And Bruno, the German Shepherd, he seemed drawn to her in a way that went beyond instinct. From that day they were often seen together. She would crawl toward him without fear. He would follow her at a slow, careful pace, always just a step behind. No one needed to say anything. They moved as if in a quiet conversation written in footsteps and breath. I began to wonder if she was the reason he had kept going through the rain, if she was the reason he had not given up. There are moments in life when the world stops speaking, and something more profound begins to speak instead. The days that followed felt slower, heavier, as though the air itself had grown aware of them. Rain came and went, leaving streets polished and quiet, and wherever Amara went, Bruno was there, not always visible, but always close. It was no longer chance. He was following her. I began to notice it in small moments. At the market, he would sit at the edge of the lot, his gaze fixed on her stroller, ears pricked as if guarding her without permission. On quiet streets, he moved beside her, his steps measured, almost reverent, as if he knew something fragile needed protecting. One afternoon, I found them again in the park, the sky swollen with grey clouds. Amara had wandered toward the far edge, where the grass met a shallow creek. Her tiny boots splashed in the water as she crouched to look at something invisible to the rest of us. Bruno lay nearby, his body curled protectively around her path, eyes half closed but alert. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her small hand rested against his head again, and the two of them stayed there like that for a long while, silence stretching between them like a promise. It was no accident, I realized. He was no longer just an injured dog in the rain. He was hers now, quietly claiming her as his own without a sound. And she had claimed him too. I began to watch more closely after that day. I saw the way his breathing shifted, when she was near, slower, steadier, as though her presence soothed him. The limp in his shoulder grew less pronounced, though the scar remained a silent map of where he had been. He moved with more purpose now, not dragging himself forward, but carrying himself as if he had something to protect. There was no loud display, no dramatic gesture, Just small acts of care, a nudge when she stumbled, a careful retreat when she reached for something dangerous, a silent shift in his position so she could pass safely. The neighbors began to notice too. They began leaving bowls of water where she played, sometimes scraps of bread. But Bruno never approached them unless she was there. Without her, he seemed to shrink into the background, like a shadow waiting to fade. One rainy evening, I saw it clearly, the transformation that had been unfolding. Amara was sitting under the skeletal frame of an old playground swing. Her hood was loose, rain dripping into her hair. Bruno lay at her feet, chest rising and falling with slow breaths. A faint fog curled around them, and the air was still except for the sound of water dripping from the swing's chains. She reached for him again, her small hand brushing his head. He leaned into her touch with a softness that no one else had ever seen. For a moment, I thought he might close his eyes forever in that silence. But instead he shifted, lifting his head, his gaze sweeping the empty park before settling back on her. It was not hunger or fear in his eyes. It was something quieter, something older, loyalty. It was the morning after a long, wet night that I first heard about it. The whisper came through the neighborhood like wind through dead leaves. Bruno wasn't welcome. Someone had called animal control. Others muttered about safety, responsibility, rules. They spoke quietly, but their words carried weight. Bruno had been there so long, they said. Injured, unclaimed, a danger. Even if no one had ever seen him act out. That afternoon I found him with Amara again. They were near the edge of a narrow alley, where she had wandered to collect something she could not name. Bruno was lying low, head resting on his paw, but his ears were raised at every sound. Amara crouched beside him, her hood slipping loose so her hair fell wet against her cheek. Her tiny fingers brushed the fur at his neck, not in play, but in quiet reassurance. When I called her name softly from behind, she looked up for only a moment before returning to her silent vigil beside him. Later I saw the trucks arrive. They came quietly but with an unmistakable weight. Animal control workers in dull uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. Their eyes were drawn to him immediately. The whispers rose, then the ones about danger, liability, and the law. Amara's mother appeared behind them, her face pale and tired. I could see her hesitation. The child's small hand gripped her mother's coat. The German shepherd lifted his head at the sound of voices, but he did not move. He stayed beside her, breathing slow and deliberate. One of the workers stepped closer. He spoke softly, almost politely. But there was no mistaking the meaning. They wanted him gone. Her mother looked down at the child. Amara did not speak, but she did not move away either. Her small hand stayed against him. Bruno lifted his head just enough to look at her, and for a moment I thought he would growl, but he did not. Instead, his gaze softened. The worker gestured again, voice low but firm. The mother's shoulders sagged. She looked torn between the weight of what was being demanded and something far quieter in her child's presence. I stayed back, watching. It was not a battle of words. It was a battle of will. The child's small hand remained on his neck. And then she shifted forward, leaning closer as if to tell him something no one else could hear. There was no sound, but I saw his ears flick slightly. His breathing slowed, his eyes fixed on hers. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the world around them, but in the world they inhabited together. Her mother finally stepped forward, her voice breaking softly. She told the workers to wait. Bruno stayed where he was, his gaze never leaving Amara. No one moved for a long moment. The drizzle fell heavier now. The alley smelled of wet stone and quiet defiance. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized this was no longer just about an injured dog or a child wandering in the rain. This was about something deeper, a quiet loyalty that could not be forced apart without cost. The rain came harder that evening. It fell in quiet sheets that softened the world, washing away edges, blurring lines between streets and sky. The alley where Bruno waited with Amara felt smaller somehow, closed in by the weight of what was about to happen. Animal control stood nearby, clipboard still in hand. Her mother's shoulders carried the weight of decision. The air was heavy with something unspoken, a choice that could not be undone. Amara remained crouched beside Bruno. Her small hand stayed on his neck, steady and certain. She did not look at her mother, did not look at the officers. She was speaking in a language only he could hear. I could see it then, the bond between them was not something that could be explained. It was not the result of kindness or need. It was something older, deeper, like a quiet promise kept in the middle of loss. Her mother took a step toward them, her breath visible in the cold rain. She looked at Bruno and then at Amara. Her voice broke softly. "We'll take him. He stays." It was not a loud declaration. There was no applause, no triumph, only the sound of rain falling heavier, a decision spoken quietly into the storm. The officers exchanged looks. One nodded slowly, stepping back. The others gathered their equipment. They did not take him away. Bruno shifted, rising on stiff legs. His wound still showed faintly under the rain, but his eyes carried something different now, something close to peace. He stepped forward toward Amara, slow, deliberate, as if to test her certainty. She leaned forward and touched his muzzle again, her fingers lingering in the wet fur. He lowered his head so her touch could reach deeper. Then he stepped fully toward her, pressing his shoulder against her small body. She let out a sound that was half breath, half sigh. Her mother stepped closer, taking Amara's hand. Bruno moved then, not away from her but beside her, as if he had chosen a place to stand forever. No one spoke for a long moment. The alley was silent except for the rain, falling steady and quiet. Somewhere nearby, a single crow called once sharp and clear, then silence returned. It was a quiet redemption, not the kind of moment that demands applause, but the kind that lingers long after. That night, Bruno was given a bed, though he did not use it at first. He stayed close to Amara, lying beside her crib, head resting just at the edge where she could reach him. She slept with her small hand on his neck, breathing slow and even. I watched them from the doorway, the air thick with rain and quiet. Somewhere in that silence, I understood something I could not put into words. Rescue is not always about saving. Sometimes it is about staying. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world quiet and washed clean. The streets glistened under pale light, and the air smelled of earth and something softer promise. Inside the small apartment, Bruno lay curled beside Amara's crib. Her breathing was slow and steady, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her small shoulders. His chest rose and fell in time with hers, a silent rhythm neither of them would ever need to speak about. Her mother moved quietly across the room, pulling the window curtain aside to let in the soft light. She paused to look at them, her eyes heavy but still carrying a fragile relief. There was no triumph in her expression, only acceptance. I stood by the doorway watching them in silence. The world outside felt far away. Here there was only this small room, a dog, a child, and something unspoken binding them together. I remembered the first night I saw him, curled under the street lamp, breathing shallow and alone in the rain. I thought then that the story would end there in the wet silence of a forgotten parking lot. But it had not ended. It had transformed. Bruno stirred softly, stretching before shifting his weight closer to her crib. Amara stirred too, her small hand lifting to rest against his neck in the quiet way she had learned. Her fingers brushed his fur, and his breath shifted in what felt like contentment. Her mother watched for a long moment, then whispered something I could not hear. Bruno's ears flicked slightly, and he lowered his head again, resting it closer to her tiny feet. There was no more danger now. No more threats, no more waiting, only this quiet trust, unbroken and deep. Later, the world would say it was rescue. They would speak of bravery and kindness, but those words would never capture it. This was something softer, something quieter. It was redemption lived without ceremony. A leash was placed by the door that afternoon, but it stayed unused. Bruno did not need it. Wherever Amara went, he went too, not because she called him, not because she commanded him, but because she was the place where he belonged now. The mother watched them together one last time before closing the door behind her. I could see the weight in her shoulders ease just a little. Outside, the world was already moving again, but inside that small space, time felt different. The rain had stopped, but something deeper had begun. Bruno lay at the edge of her crib, breathing steady and slow. Amara slept. Her hand rested gently on his neck. The world outside could wait. Some stories leave us with more than an ending. They leave us with a quiet knowing that rescue is not always about saving. Sometimes it is about staying. In the stillness after the storm, a wounded dog found his place. A child found hers. And together, they found something neither could have spoken aloud home. It is a reminder that love is not loud. It is soft, it is patient. It is the hand that reaches without asking, the presence that lingers without demand. And in that quiet, the world begins to heal. Like, share, and tell us where in the world are you watching from today.